The next item on the agenda is debates on cases of breaches of human rights, democracy and the rule of law. The first debate is on the deterioration of media freedom in Belarus, notably the case of Charter 97. I would like to give the floor for 1 minute to Mr. Tannock as an author.
Mr. President, I cautiously welcome the 2016 decision to ease some of the restrictive measures against Belarusian officials as part of an EU broader strategy of engagement with that isolated country. But now, given the annexation of Crimea by Russia and its offensive in the east of Ukraine, there's a belief that Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, may have somehow welcomed warmer relations with the European Union as a counterweight to Russia's dominance of the country, fearing that he too could go the way of President Yanukovych of Ukraine. Such an approach, it was hoped, might yield results in terms of greater freedom and democratic and human rights within Belarus and opening up the country to the West. As the case of the website Charter 97, however, illustrates, such thinking was far too optimistic. As our resolution today makes clear, journalists are being targeted by police in a systematic and deliberate policy of harassment and intimidation. Death threats to the editor-in-chief, Natalia Radina, being a particularly concerning example. Hopes of President Lukashenko changing his stripes were perhaps premature, but we can remain certain that the continued support for organisations such as Charter 97 will be vital to ensuring one day a democratic, free and successful Belarus in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Austrevicius for 1 minute. He's also one of the authors.
Pone pirmininkė, komisarė, kolegos.
The chairman, colleagues, is not a resolution on human rights in Belarus. Today we speak about media freedom, actually absence of media freedom and persistent harassment of free people in Belarus. Now, internet is targeted. All people who comment online will have to be registered and their data will be transferred to the KGB. The KGB has unlimited imagination and powers, as we perfectly know. I want to state very clearly, first, it is not enough to reiterate our words of support for the website Charter 97. The Commission and the External Action Service must make sure that the block of the website is lifted. The website needs concrete financial assistance, and it must come from the European Union. Second, the political monster Lukashenko is creating a nuclear monster, the power plant in Astrovets, that will undermine the fundamental freedom of the people of Belarus and all Europe, their right to security. The relations of the actions of the EU must be based on strict conditions and clear demands, and not efforts to please. The Commission and the External Action Service must stop being blind and naive. It's enough ignoring that Minsk does not even try to pretend it's changing. And I would like to ask you to stop the negotiations on partnership priorities and take serious action.
Mr. Rope for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, Commissioner, colleagues. Belarus today, in fact, is an example showing clearly how the restrictions of free media and violations of human rights can threaten the security of the country, of the region, and the entire continent. Belarus has survived one of the largest nuclear catastrophes in history, and now it's getting involved into a nuclear adventure which can lead to even worse damage than Chernobyl. Belarus has restricted its society, its independent media, for instance the Charter 97. At the same time, it allowed Putin's regime to construct a nuclear monster on the border with the European Union. Even the Soviet Union had suspended the plans to construct a monster like this in Belarus after the nuclear catastrophe in Chernobyl. I keep being asked by electorate, what is the EU doing to ensure nuclear safety in the European Union? Let me ask the Commission, how are we going to ensure the stress tests in the nuclear power plant in Ostrovets? How will you ensure that it implements all EU requirements? The millions of EU taxpayers' money are going to Belarus. Don't you think that they are being used for the construction of the nuclear power plant and restriction of media freedom? Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Moody for 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. A free and independent press is a fundamental European value, and it must be an essential part of the EU's relationship with Belarus. Charter 97 provides a clear example of where our values are being undermined. Their news website was blocked in Belarus and more recently in Russia, in an attempt to stamp out informed public debate. Other websites and social media are also being tracked, preventing anonymity in order to prevent free speech. This highlights a worrying trend of a wider clampdown on civil society in an already oppressive environment. Belarus is acting against free association too, most worryingly with the case against independent trade unionists. In 2016, the EU lifted most sanctions that were in place against Belarusian officials and companies in a spirit of engagement, hoping that better relations would lead to better fundamental freedoms. It is now clear that this is not working. The case of Charter 97 and that of the trade unionists most recently make this failure clear. Now is the time for action. The EEAS needs to get funding in place for organisations such as Charter 97 and Belsat TV that provide independent broadcasting. This funding needs to be direct and it needs to be swift. The EU's support for Belarus must have conditions, and there must be consequences for not meeting those conditions. Harassment, death threats, and the imprisonment of journalists, human rights defenders, trade unionists and others are surely the sort of violations that should cost Belarus its EU financial support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Urban Crespo, 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much, President. Now, we have this resolution, and I would say that it showcases the double standards of this chamber, because the resolution talks about the crackdown in Belarus, and it says that this crackdown means that we can't have closer ties with Belarus, and there are problems with the Eastern Partnership. However, between 2014 and 2016, the European assistance package to Belarus, on the basis of the European Neighbourhood Instrument, was to the tune of 91.5 million euro. The agreement is based on human mobility. What a coincidence! And it's about externalizing border control to reduce migratory flows by providing support to detention centers for migrants. What does this mean? This means that we acknowledge the fact that there are human rights violations in Belarus, but we're turning a blind eye, and we're paying Belarus, we're paying a lot of money to a state that we're saying is violating human rights, so they can act as a police guard on our borders. Very consistent, ladies and gentlemen. Belarus does not have an asylum system and has returned people who were seeking international protection to countries where they could be persecuted later on. This shows how everything goes as long as we can reduce migration to the EU. It's truly alarming to see that a lot of political groups in this chamber show double standards. They have not agreed to put this into the resolution. Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Stetina, and that ends the list of authors.
Thanks for the floor, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Free media, independent press. Lukashenko's enemies number one. Journalists in independent media have been a target of a non-stop process of intimidation. The information portal Charter 97 has been blocked for almost a year now. In 2010, one of its co-founders was murdered. The charter had been chased out of Belarus, and it was forced to broadcast from Poland since 2011. Its website being blocked is a financial catastrophe. In August this year, there was a wave of arrests and confiscations at several of its offices. The journalists are facing indictments and time in prison. Only last year, approximately 100 journalists were arrested. Almost 2 years ago, we abolished the restrictive measures towards Belarus. The Belarusian side is using European money as a consequence, and I would therefore like to appeal to the necessary conditionality of our cooperation, conditions of maintaining human rights and civil freedoms. Lukashenko is showing us that instead of democratizing his country, he's just tightening screws and persecutes those who try to inform the citizens of Belarus about what's actually going on in the country. Let us not trust dictators, ladies and gentlemen. The web portal Charter 97 was founded based on a Belarusian movement, Charter 97, which was a movement inspired by the Czechoslovak Charter 77. And this is one more reason, for me personally, ladies and gentlemen, why I feel the urgent duty as a Czech citizen, the duty to fight against human rights infringements in Belarus. Freedoms are indivisible, ladies and gentlemen. Freedoms in Belarus are our freedoms. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Let us now take those speakers speaking on behalf of their political group. On behalf of the EPP, Mr. Zdrojewski for 1 minute.
Jako przewodniczący delegacji do...
Thank you very much. As the chairman of the Belarus delegation, I care about how precise this discussion is. I will not repeat what other members have already said, but let me add one more item which I think is important. The culture. Belarus can and should be proud of her artists, creators. They have won a Nobel Prize winner for literature, but theatre in Belarus is being oppressed. I'm talking about the free theatre of Belarus, which is being oppressed in a number of ways. So the artists, professors who want to help the theatre, as well as members of the audience. The reason I'm talking about it is that we should take steps to have an opinion in the Parliament which is as precise as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Socialists and Democrats, Mrs. Julie Ward for 1 minute.
The EU must take action on Belarus. The passivity of the European Commission and the European External Action Service has now emboldened Lukashenko's government. The human rights situation in particular, when it comes to press freedom, is deteriorating quickly. And the treatment of political prisoners is horrific in a country where the death penalty remains a shameful option. The case of human rights defender Mikhail Zamshushny is particularly horrific. He has been kept in solitary confinement for most of the time since the last week of July. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is in Europe. Dmitry Bobrik, a journalist arrested in August in a vicious attack on press freedom, has reported that whilst in detention, he was forced to sign a cooperation agreement with the KGB. And the case of Charter 97, as already described, is very concerning. And I've worked with that organisation over the past few months, and they feel totally betrayed by the EU. I therefore urge Commissioner Hahn and the High Representative to take action and demand improvements in Belarus's human rights record.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the European Conservatives and Reformists, Mr. Jurek.
President, ladies and gentlemen, Belarus is a close neighbor, an important country bordering on a number of EU member states. the Belarusian nation these days is fighting for its memory, historical memory. According to Norman Davies, a Polish-British historian, 250,000 people were murdered in Belarus in the past. Now, this place of martyrdom is being desacralized. And the cemetery in Belarus, where few crosses have been put because most of the victims are unknown, protecting this cemetery is very important. And I'm calling on the Belarusian authorities, please put a stop to the desacralization of that cemetery, of that place. This is a place of great tragedy that should connect us all. It's time to condemn communism. Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of the Liberals and Democrats, Mr. Selimovic for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. The situation of press in Belarus has continued to worsen. Belarus is now on the rank 155 out of 180 in the World Press Freedom Index. Harassments, intimidations, threats now form part of the daily life of the independent journalists in Belarus. In early August 2018, Belarusian authorities carried out raids in the newsroom of the independent Belarusian outlet Tutbu Belapan. At the same time, the government recently extended its control over media outlets by imposing everybody to register to the authorities before even being able to publish. This is beyond what anybody, even in this chamber, could imagine. Therefore, Belarusian authorities have to lift the ban on the Charter 97 and on the other independent media. And I ask this chamber to continue this support, our support to the Belarusian NGOs. We owe to the citizens of Belarus to defend their freedom of expression. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. For 1 minute, on behalf of the United Left, Mrs. Vergier. I'm sorry, I apologize, Mrs. Vergier. 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. Belarus is often considered Europe's last dictatorship, the only European country that does not belong to the Council of Europe. It still has the death penalty. No elections have been deemed to comply with international standards since 2001. Mr. Lukashenko was re-elected in 2015 with a majority of 83.5%. So the freedom of expression is regularly flouted, and the blocking of the Charter 97 website is just one example. However, compared to other countries, the EU is turning a blind eye, even negotiating a visa liberalisation agreement. Why? Naivety, perhaps, or an attempt to go down the same road as with Ukraine, perhaps. Belarus polices for the EU. The lion's share of 91 million spent under the neighbourhood instrument is devoted to outsourcing border checks, primarily in the interest of the Polish government. Hundreds of people from Chechnya, Tajikistan and Syria have been held up in Brest at the Belarusian border. Poland has refused to examine their asylum requests, and they have been sent back to countries where they face poor treatment, torture. Poland is far more indulgent when it comes to Ukrainian workers, has no problem decrying migratory invasions from the south, refuses to participate in European solidarity. We are turning a blind eye to what is happening at this border, and these people are being turned away to countries where we denounce human rights breaches to the east and south. So we're seeing inconsistency, as always, in the interest of member states.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the political group list. And now Mrs. Sojdrova.
Thank you. Colleagues, a society as free as its media, I'm very happy that the European Parliament agrees upon support to free media. Journalists in Belarus are subject to a new wave of oppression. Critics of Alexander Lukashenko are being arrested, beaten, or have to pay fines. Government blocks free internet media. Also, it blocked the news platform Charter 97 that served as a platform for those who try to support democracy in Belarus. In June this year, the Belarus Belarusian parliament approved a draft media law under the disguise of fighting disinformation, but this is more censorship. We have to stand up for freedom of journalism in Belarus. Attacks against journalists are unacceptable, as well as censorship is unacceptable. The freedom of association and other freedoms should be our conditions for further cooperation with Belarus.
Thank you. Mr. de Mesmaeker, 1 minute.
Intimidation, arrests and censorship. This has left Belarus at a paltry 155th on the World Press Freedom Index. The last dictator in Europe, Lukashenko, still has an iron grip on the media after 24 years and tolerates no critical journalism. The same applied in the wake of the peaceful mass protests that took place in February 2017. 700 people were detained, 100 of them journalists. And the intimidation of independent media continues today. Let us not be naive. Lukashenko is not interested in reform. The rapprochement he's searching for with the West is founded solely upon his desire for more money, more power and more recognition. He is simply cutting his losses. Lukashenko only understands clear language. As long as press freedom is not being respected, there can be no rapprochement.
Thank you very much. Now we can move on to Catch the Eye. I have 4 requests. I accept all 4. Mr. Faria, 1 minute. Thank you very much, President. Last year, I spoke about the crackdown in this country. But unfortunately, what I said last year still applies today, and in fact, it's even worse. Bloggers, journalists, human rights defenders, especially those linked to Charter 97, are being attacked, and this goes against freedom of media and expression. We're talking about a quasi-dictatorial system that doesn't accept criticism. This is the only European country where there is still the death penalty. And it's the only European country that is building a nuclear power station. And it's extremely important to make sure that European relations are conditional on freedom of expression and the respect for human rights. We gave the Sakharov Prize to a group of Belarusians, and therefore we have to condemn this flouting of freedom of expression. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Mr. Polčák for 1 minute.
Thank you for the floor. I would like to condemn as strictly as possible the procedures by Lukashenko's government oppressing freedom and pluralism of views, freedom of the press. Sometimes we look at cases that happen very far away from us in different civilizations and often overlook such blaring examples of breaches of EU's fundamental values that take place in our neighborhood. We should really look at what is going on in the EU and in our neighborship, and this is not to diminish the importance of distant cases of breaches. Freedom of press is certainly a democratic value, and I would like not only to support this freedom by my speech here, but also by my vote that comes up.
Mr. Kukan, for 1 minute.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie przewodniczący. Quote, if we are supposed to become nails in the coffins of a tyrant, I would like to be one of them. These are the words of Oleg Sentsov, Ukrainian film director jailed in Siberia, but they fully apply in their scope of the works of Charta 97 and other independent journalists in Belarus. They have become the uncomfortable nails to the political establishment. The EU has made the first sign of goodwill towards Belarus in 2016. It's now time to firmly remind Belarusian authorities to make good on their promise to move forward on human rights issues. One sign of positive developments from the Belarusian side would be the unblock Charter 97 and intimidation independent media and journalists, drop fabricated charges and move towards enabling of independent media environment. This is all part of the international and regional human rights instruments adopted by Belarus. Failure to respect these commitments should result in EU's resolute action in Belarus. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the last speaker is Mr. Iturgaiz for 1 minute.
Thank you. As we all know, Belarus is a dictatorship in the 21st century, anchored in Europe. There is a crackdown on those citizens who defend human rights in Belarus, and at the same time, there is a repression and threats against the media that want to provide information freely about what is happening in that country. President, God creates them and they get together is a Spanish expression, and Lukashenko is the intimate friend of Mr. Maduro in Venezuela, another dictator, and he does exactly what Mr. Maduro is doing with the media. They're persecuting journalists, like in the case of Charter 97. They're arresting them and putting them in jail. We have to warn Belarus that they have gone beyond our red lines, and this seriousness means that we should impose sanctions on Lukashenko's government in Belarus.
Thank you very much. And to wrap up, Commissioner Bieńkowska.
Members, EU-Belarus relations continue to be driven by the policy of the critical engagement on the EU side. As always, we remain very attentive to the human rights situation in the country. At the same time, we believe that progress in a variety of fields can be better achieved by means of enhanced cooperation. In this context, the EU-Belarus relations have come a long way over the last 2, maybe 3 years. We have witnessed proactive participation of Belarus in the Eastern Partnership. Here we see, of course, the resumption of the EU-Belarus sectoral dialogues and the signature of the Mobility Partnership in October 2016. People-to-people contacts, including youth exchanges, are also developing through the EU programmes such as MOST, Erasmus+, Horizon 2020, as well as Belarus' accession to the Bologna process. We are now close to finalising the joint partnership priorities, which will be the first document of this kind between the EU and Belarus, an important building blocks in our relations, setting the strategic frame for our cooperation in the coming years, and of course in which human rights and the freedom of media issues play an important role. We have recently observed an increased willingness by the Belarusian authorities to engage constructively with the EU on the human rights dialogue, including during our last meeting on the 17th of July in Minsk. Our support to and involvement of civil society will remain an essential part of our policy. The extensive agenda of this dialogue covered also the concerns on freelance journalists in Belarus and, of course, the lack of legislation in this field. However, this increased willingness for debate has unfortunately not yet led to the measurable legislative improvements of the human rights situation, notably on the freedom of media. In response to the new draft law on the media, the EU used the opportunity of the human rights dialogue to reiterate again the importance of freedom of expression and independence of media. We called for unrestricted access to the internet. We are very much aware that several independent media organisations are working hard to achieve meaningful results in promoting critical thinking and democratic values, and we value their work very much. The EU at the highest political level has underlined to the Belarusian authorities that repressive actions against independent media, including Charter 97 website, are contrary to the international commitments made by Belarus. We have equally called for the introduction without delay of a moratorium on the death penalty and the need to strengthen the independence of the judiciary. As we further pursue our policy of critical engagement, we will continue to follow closely development in Belarus with regard to fundamental freedoms. The EU stands ready to assist Belarus in meeting its obligation in the area of democratisation and full respect for human rights. In addition, the EU will continue to provide financial support for civil society through relevant EU both programmes and initiatives. Steps taken by Belarus to respect fundamental freedoms, rule of law and human rights will remain key for the shaping of EU policy towards Belarus. Let me also add one sentence, as we are discussing today the human rights issues, but of course nuclear safety issues are also our overall concern, EU concern. The EU is putting pressure on full transparency of the construction of the process of the new nuclear power plant in Ostrowiec. And we are also financing experts who are assisting the Belarusian new national regulation on this. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani komisarz. Otrzymałem 6.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I have received 6 drafts of the resolution. The debate is closed. The voting will take place later today. Thank you very much.
Temat kolejnej debaty.
The following debate is the United Arab Emirates, notably the situation of human rights defender Ahmed Mansour. The first to take the floor is Mrs.